Climate change will shrink U.S. economy and kill thousands, government report warns. So read the breathless, screaming headlines on CNN and elsewhere in the establishment media following the release of a government environmental report, specifically the fourth climate assessment report by the Trump administration, though not Trump himself. He disavowed any personal association with it. Are we approaching the eve of destruction, as environmental activists would have us believe? Is the report exaggerated or imprecise? Is the whole climate change issue so vital to the left, in fact, a hoax, as some conservatives believe? Joining us to separate fact from fiction on climate change is Dr. Bonner Cohen, senior fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research, where he concentrates on environmental issues. Dr. Cohen, welcome to Liberty Nation Radio.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here.
Well, I appreciate it, and I will stipulate at the outset that I have a rather limited knowledge of climate change, didn't do well in science courses in school, but I know enough to ask you to assess the predictions in this environmental report that climate change over the next several decades will cause the economy to lose hundreds of billions of dollars, or in the worst case scenario, more than 10% of its GDP by the end of the century.
After having read the report, I believe that the people who wrote the report also have a very limited understanding of the many variables that go into our ever-changing climate. The report, and I think it's important for our listeners to understand this, is being portrayed in the media as a Trump administration report. It is nothing of the sort. It is a report that is mandated by Congress to be updated and released every few years. This report has been in the works for years. It began actually under the Obama administration and is almost entirely the product of career officials. We will call these the climate deep state, embedded in federal agencies from NOAA, the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Energy, and many others. These are the people who put this report together, and they did so that they could produce a document that was an embarrassment to the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. Why did the Trump administration allow this to happen? Well, actually, it's its own fault, because during the time that the document was being put together, there weren't enough political appointees in the Trump administration to put a stop to this.
Right.
About the only thing they got right was releasing the report the day after Thanksgiving. All that said, the document is exactly what one would expect. It is scare propaganda, one that assumes the whole legitimacy of the argument that man-made emissions of greenhouse gases are artificially and dangerously warming the planet. And if we do not take urgent action and take it now, all sorts of disasters will take place, such as the usual litany: rising sea levels, soaring temperatures, and the like. The language in this is purposely designed to scare people to death and to provide an excuse for all sorts of groups to sue the government to take action on climate change and to do away with Trump deregulatory actions.
Now, this talk of climate change is not new. We've heard this for many years. Have the environmental activists, foremost among them Al Gore, who basically brought this issue into the public consciousness with his Inconvenient Truth book and movie, have these people been held accountable for the predictions they made over a decade ago, and how accurate were those predictions?
Those predictions were way off. They weren't close to being accurate. That's why something that used to be called global warming was relabeled climate change. That gave them a little cover. So just in case we have an unusual cold winter, as we have had, contrary to all their predictions, well, that's climate change. Too much rain, too little rain, what have you, that we are told is a reflection of climate change. Under the theory, man-made emissions of greenhouse gases, which we are told are heat-trapping gases, should lead to a rise in temperature in a linear fashion. Well, it has not. In fact, there has been absolutely no rise in temperatures over the last 20 years. And they've adopted a term, climate change, which is actually redundant because climates always change.
Really? Who knew? Who knew?
Right.
Who knew
Right.
that? Who knew that the weather changes?
During the age of the dinosaurs, for example, there was absolutely no ice on either the North Pole or the South Pole. And atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide, CO2, were as much as 20 times higher than what we are experiencing today. 250 years ago, we were at the end of what is known as the Little Ice Age, which, aside from being a much cooler planet than what we have now, atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide were only around 250 parts per million. Today they are around 400 parts per million, and for that we should be very thankful because higher levels of CO2 are very good for agriculture and good for greening the planet. The last thing we want to do is keep CO2 levels artificially low because we have 8 billion people to feed on this planet, some of whom are right on the edge of starvation, and we need to produce as much food as possible to do that, and CO2 levels are a tremendous benefit to agriculture. So just think, the last 2 million years, which in geological terms is nothing, we have had 17 ice ages.
Wow.
On 17 different occasions, the Earth has cooled off so much that we had gigantic glaciers stretching from the North Pole as far south as Kentucky that were as thick as 2 miles. And on 17 different occasions, for reasons we quite frankly don't understand, those ice ages came to an end, and all of those gigantic sheets of ice melted. We're living now in an interglacial period, which means we're living between the last ice age and the next one. And that's the real climate change we ought to be worried about, not the climate change of fear-mongering environmentalists who are simply trying to create a market for renewable energy, which is one of their biggest sources of funding, but rather what happens if the Earth starts to cool, because that is something that will be very detrimental to human health and the environment.
Thank you so much for joining us. You've enlightened me and hopefully our listeners as well.
Thank you.
That is Dr. Bonner Cohen, Senior Fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research.